Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Suman, your host for today. I hope everyone's having a good time with family and friends this season. As I was winding down a few days back, I thought to myself that from here on, it's going to be quiet on the policy front. But I was wrong, and how? A lot has happened in the last few weeks. We've had the new labor codes, the nuclear bill, and a lot more. But the one that has really caught everybody's attention in the last week, definitely, is the Viksit Bharat Guarantee for Rozgar and Ajivika Mission, Gramin. In short, VBGRAMG Act of 2025. That's quite a mouthful, but this is an act that posits to build on the existing Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Okay? To discuss this and the larger topic of employment guarantees, social movements, what is the landscape in the rural areas, employment landscape, I have with me R Sharan. Welcome, Sharan. Welcome to Takshashila. Welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much for having me, Suman. Very happy to be here.
Great. Thanks for taking time out of your vacation time for this. But by way of short introduction, Sharan is an economist and is currently an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has a PhD from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Much of his work is set in India around rural government institutions, and he's investigating the intersection of politics, incentives, bureaucracy, affirmative action, and collective action. I don't think we could have got a better person to talk on this topic, the VBGRAMG and the MNREGA combination, and around things of employment guarantees and the rural economy itself. The reason I say Sharan is the best person at this point to talk about this is because he, unlike most of us, has actually seen how MNREGA has worked on the ground. He's the author of the book Last Among Equals, on which we had an episode back in 2022. The book actually investigates themes of policy, social movements, representation, and a lot of other things. Okay, this, with his training as an economist, puts him in that very sweet spot of theory and practice. A small side note, he also co-hosts a musical podcast, Brothers in Music, which is very, very interesting. For those who are musically inclined, please do visit that show too. Sharan, welcome once again. And I'd like to straight away dive in because there's so much that has happened and so many opinions out there. And I'd just like a quick take of what you think of this whole episode. Now that it is an act, I don't know really how this will go in terms of, whether it will go back or we don't know what happens. But your quick take, and then we can go into details.
Sure. Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. There are many scholars who work on MNREGA, and I'm lucky to have spent some time over the last few years kind of seeing this. MNREGA is what the NREGA is called colloquially often, and so I'm going to refer to it as that throughout the podcast. I think like a lot of, political commentators, economists, academics, policymakers, opposition leaders, maybe even some people in the BJP, I was caught completely off guard by the sudden announcement of this VBGRAMG bill, by the fact that the MNREGA, which was around for a bit over 20 years, actually, almost 20 years, has kind of been completely replaced by something like this. I agree with you that changes are pretty sweeping. They're somewhat radical. They pose it, I like the way you phrased it, they pose it to be an update of the old MNREGA Act. But as we look at this in more detail, it comes to light that there are some changes that could really make it a much more distorted version of the original purpose of the MNREGA Act. And we can talk about it as we go along. I just want to say one thing that, the last couple of weeks have been pretty intense, not just for people like you and me who kind of think about this in terms of policy, but also from voices on the ground. I was talking to Sanjay Sani, who is the protagonist of my book, Last Among Equals. He's an MNREGA activist. I talk about his journey starting the Muzaffarpur social movement. And last night I was talking to him, and the government has basically told him and the workers of Muzaffarpur that for the next few months, they will not be providing any work under MNREGA and that's not what the rules stipulate under the new bill. The new bill says you can provide work under the old act till April, but the government has already decided to kind of just throw their hands up and say sorry. So this is kind of very interesting, somewhat scary times for a lot of people.
Yeah, very sobering start to the podcast itself. Right? Yeah. I mean, for people like us and our listeners, maybe it does not make a difference to our daily lives, but we should be aware that a lot of the rural economy, the rural livelihoods have been depending on this, and just pulling the plug out of here is going to cause a lot of angst, is going to cause a lot of problems within the rural economy. Be that as may, but now you have really actually worked with people here on the ground, right? So what is it that makes MNREGA such a lifeline? What is it? How does it work for people who are actually, availing of this? I mean, I shouldn't call it a scheme, but whatever. Yeah. For want of a better word.
So great place to start. And I'm going to make 3 broad points. The first thing I'll make is I'll talk about the MNREGA Act itself and how it was written on paper. Then I'll talk about its implementation and how there's a gap between what the Act actually envisages and what the actual implementation looks like on the ground, even before VB Ramji bill came into the picture. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about despite there being that gap, how it still is the lifeline, like you just mentioned, for many households, especially poor, low caste, many women actually, workers in rural areas. So let's start with the Act itself. The Act actually was pretty radical in the sense that it simply said that any worker residing in a village who wanted work could approach the local government and demand work at minimum wage and could get work within 15 days in the village itself, up to 100 days of work for their household. So imagine you're a rural worker, it's agriculture off season. Typically, that's when you're out of work. You still want something to keep you going. MNREGA allowed you to go just ask your village sarpanch, hey, I need work. And the village sarpanch is supposed to collect a group of workers and then set up a work site where you can do anything from building, local water tanks, or even Indra Awas Yojana houses or anything, some useful work in the village. So that's how the Act was kind of envisaged. The Act actually had very interesting ideas. So one was, of course, minimum wage. So you had to pay a minimum wage, equal pay for both men and women, which is also pretty interesting and different. The Act actively encouraged people to come together to demand work. So kind of also in some sense had a vision of kind of collective action and collective mobilization amongst workers, which was interesting in its framing itself. The Act also tried to create a wage floor in rural areas so that, if you were a landlord and you wanted to tell a worker that, hey, I'm going to pay you 80 rupees per day for work, you can go and tell them that, no, I don't want to work with you. I can go and ask my sarpanch and they'll pay me more under the MNREGA, right? So you try to create this kind of wage floor. And the Act also mandated that payments had to be made in time. So you demand work, you get work within 15 days, and then you get paid within 15 days after that, after working, right? So it was actually very interestingly built and envisaged. Over the years, MNREGA implementation itself has varied across states. In the better performing states, often in the south like Andhra, Tamil Nadu, but also some northern states like Rajasthan, MNREGA actually worked pretty well to generate both work days for men and women. And, there's a lot of research that documents that some of what work that was undertaken was actually pretty useful, often kind of increasing everything from groundwater tables, using irrigation works that people are doing, to kind of making agriculture more productive. So there's a lot of research that also shows that the assets that were being built were not completely useless by these workers and actually helped the village itself. However, that being said, I have to also say that all the problems you can envisage with a government program of this sort were also there for NREGA. Let's start with corruption. Over the years, there's been many instances of documented corruption, mostly by members of the district administration downwards. So typically, you would say somebody has worked 20 days under the scheme, and that's what the records would show. But actually, workers would only get 8 or 9 days of work, and so there would be this kind of gap. And there have been steps taken to kind of reduce the amount of corruption. So corruption is one thing that people have documented and also tried to address using things even like social audits and digital payments infrastructure and all of these things. All of these things don't work perfectly, but and some of them create more problems than solutions, but they exist. Right. So that's one issue. The other big issue is that the NREGA minimum wage was actually roughly what the agricultural wage was in 2005. Right. Over time, the agricultural wages went up, but the NREGA wages kind of remained constant. The real wages kind of remained broadly the same. What that meant was it was no longer the kind of nice outside option that many male workers, especially of working age, would turn to. And increasingly, you see this, that the share of women working under NREGA keeps going up because women continue to be kind of priced out of the private labor market in some sense because they're not able to produce the kind of output that the private market would kind of want. And so they continue to work in places like NREGA. And in Bihar, especially in Muzaffarpur, where I do a lot of work, the typical NREGA worker I always think of is the 45-year-old grandmother who basically has done her duties of child rearing and stuff and can now kind of do some work on the side. So all of this to say that, the act envisage something. What actually happens on the ground is different. There's corruption, there's rationing of work. When you want work, you don't get work. The mukhyas and the sarpanches conspire against the workers because they don't want the agricultural wages to go up. But despite all this, over 20 years, you've seen useful assets being built. In fact, the biggest way NREGA has actually helped the rural poor is not just by giving wages directly in the hands of workers, but allowing workers to use that NREGA wage as a wage floor to bargain with local landlords.
That's a great point. Yeah, for the listeners, look at it as a way of bargaining, much like we do at our jobs, and we don't hold anything against anyone bargaining for higher salaries or higher wages. I'm sure this gave them something. And remember, these are all unskilled laborers.
Yeah.
They don't have anything else, right? So it's only for unskilled labor, and it is a guarantee in the sense that if you do not give them work, then you are bound to make a payment. Is that
yes.
correct understanding? Yeah. So, and we have seen, like you mentioned, there were a lot of problems with the MNREGA. I think the technology part, while they tried to improve or bring in some kind of efficiency through that, there is recorded evidence of technology not working very well too, right? There have been instances where people have been asked to upload certain things on a certain, website, and only then they'll get paid and all of that, and things that were not working. Not all of it was working right in that sense, right? But yeah, you're talking about productivity and, what it has done for the labor market in the rural areas itself. So how do we look at this wage rate and or just the wages and the productivity aspect, or the contrast in these places? The common criticism we hear is that, while MNREGA actually helped with wages, they didn't do much for productivity, or it didn't do much for productivity of laborers. Right? So is that something that we should even look at when we are talking about employment guarantees, or is it something else? Is there more to it than meets the eye?
Yeah, the productivity criticism has held for a while now, actually. Many scholars have kind of said that, including the Prime Minister famously said that this is a scheme in Parliament. He said this is a scheme that allows people to dig roads and then dig holes and fill them. And I'm going to keep the scheme going only as a monument, a temple to the monument of failure of the UPA regime or whatever, right? And part of it was this feeling that the works that were created were not productive. But actually, if you travel in rural areas, you will see a lot of these local lanes, local drains, all of these, and you will see these small NREGA boards everywhere being constructed by workers by themselves. But also, like I said, it can, that's one local physical infrastructure. Then there's also creation of housing, creation of goat sheds, chicken sheds. These are all kind of augmenting rural incomes in some sense. Then there are assets that actually improve agricultural productivity. So then you have things like, local tanks, clearing up the irrigation canals before the rains come, doing kind of small works that, like, for example, tree plantation was a big thing for a few years in many states, and that kind of increased the green cover in villages. So you had a variety of different works that were being undertaken. Of course, there's always scope for improvement. I don't think anybody will say that the NREGA works are the most perfect works and the best examples of local bottom-up asset construction. But by many estimates, and there are various studies that show that basically Jharkhand's MNREGA wells, for example, there's a study by Agarwal and co-authors, show that the rates of returns are about 6% in terms of just agricultural incomes through well construction, right? So you have studies that kind of show that for every rupee spent on an asset, there's about 2 to 3 rupees worth rural productivity improvements that you can see. And so the asset criticism, while somewhat valid, is not entirely true. And I think the rural landscape would have looked quite different had it not been for NREGA.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Sharan. On that, I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about what MNREGA or any kind of employment guarantee scheme, let's even if we say VB Ramji, what does it do for policy making? Like what I'm trying to put across is something that I read some time back, that it disincentivizes reforms in other areas, or it makes the incentives for making reform in other areas so that all this unskilled labor can get sucked up is reduced, because you are in this low level equilibrium of, anyway, people are getting some money, getting some jobs. Had we done agricultural reforms, had we done something else, or even factor market reforms in a big way, such that all the unskilled labor, not all, most of the unskilled labor would have got taken by this, then the need for this would not be there. And because we have focused so much of our energies on getting this right, we have ignored the other part of the reform part. How does this play out? I mean, it sounds great in theory when we're talking about it, but how does it really play out on the ground?
I think the first thing to note when you think of an argument like this is that India is still, many parts of India, especially rural India, especially poor. There are many people who need work and need work immediately. And in that sense, NREGA offered like a nice safety net. Now, the thing to remember about NREGA was it was always meant to be a safety net. It had 100 days of work for the whole household. So which means if you're a worker and there are 3 workers in your household, that's 30 days, a month of work at minimum wage. That's all the act was basically envisaged to guarantee. So in that sense, it's not really taking away a lot of administrative attention or fiscal space to a large extent from other productive reforms that can be done. I don't think that India's manufacturing failures, for example, and I'm sure, the Takshashila audience is familiar with this. You had so many great people talk about manufacturing on your podcast. I don't think those failures can be attributed to the fact that MNREGA was implemented in 2005. I think we missed the bus of manufacturing for a whole host of other reasons. And so that's not how we should think about it. So my broad answer to your question is it's not either or. I think you can do both MNREGA while also, and you're right that the success of something like MNREGA will be that at some point, many, many, many years from now, nobody will want to get work under MNREGA at minimum wage, and they'll all have other more productive ways of kind of being employed, and that will be the true genuine success. But we are some way away from there.
Yeah. So now coming back to this act that we have new one here, how does it change the landscape? Firstly, the way I'm just leaving everything else out and I'm just talking about the right. If I just talk about the right, it is actually taking away the right, at least in my reading, because it is not a demand. It is not self-selecting. Somebody who does not have work will go and actually ask for this. It removes all of those things. So I really don't think it is an improvisation of MNREGA. It's just a replacement of MNREGA in my reading. But I'd like you to come in and see and tell us how. all?
So, I like the way you framed it. I think it's exactly right that the biggest part of MNREGA was that it allowed workers anywhere in the country to just walk up and say, give me work, and they were supposed to get work. Like we discussed earlier, there was a gap. There was already a decline in the ability of the workers to kind of get work on demand. And it's declined a bit because of, mainly, I would say, in my opinion, the wage not being high enough. So lots of workers with voice were no longer demanding as fervently, but also that the local state was very worried about exactly the good stuff that NREGA was doing, which is increase rural agricultural wages, such that workers actually got some kind of minimum wage, right? So the context to VBG Ramji is that MNREGA by itself wasn't necessarily achieving everything it had wanted to achieve on paper. The problem that VBG Ramji does is that it brings in a solution that actually further exacerbates this problem. How? It says that one, that the central government will decide where workers can actually choose to go and demand and when. What do you mean by where? There will be certain areas of the country where the central government will say we have higher allocations of funds for these areas, and here we can provide up to X amount of work. But again, it's X amount of work. We are not going to give more than that. So the demand aspect kind of becomes more fuzzy, like you mentioned. And secondly, during the peak agricultural season, for about 60 days, nobody can demand work anywhere in the country. And that's part of the rules. The third thing it does is it says we can no longer bear the fiscal burden of providing a MNREGA fund. So states have to kind of step up and pay 40% of the funds. So all these three things together conspire to create a situation where workers can no longer get work on demand. States will simply say we don't have the money to kind of pay 40% of the bill. That's not something we were prepped to do. And again, just taking a step back, a lot of these teething issues could have been thought through better, with better discussions with the states in parliament. Just a more gradual rollout could have resulted, I think, in a much better version of an improved MNREGA, as opposed to this kind of ramming through of a bill of this sort. And so, broadly speaking, I think these are the deficiencies of VBG Ramji, and my view is that over time, this will basically result in a situation where work demand will collapse, and the center will use that idea, that fact, to say that, oh, MNREGA, VBG Ramji is no longer requires allocations of 90,000 crore rupees, and they will cut down allocations. The burden on the states will go up, and in 4 or 5 years, if my view is that this could really result in employment guarantee kind of becoming a much smaller part of our policy landscape, and that's not a good thing for workers.
Yeah, just to give our listeners some context, earlier in the MNREGA scheme of things, the center or the union government actually bore 90% of the cost,
Yes.
whereas the state government was to take up 10%, and it was material costs and labor costs were 100%, material costs were 100% by the center, and the balance was done by the states. Yeah, so that changes a lot of things. So if the way we are talking about it, if it is going to cause so much of a uproar or some kind of upheaval within the rural landscape, what is the political economy around this? The interesting thing that we have seen across the last few years, at least, is that there are a lot of cash transfers that are going on, right? We just saw in Bihar that just before the election, there was this whole cash transfer thing. And so when governments, I'm not talking with just this government, and we have seen that the number of states that have employed cash guarantees have increased in the last 15 years, right? I think we have about 15 states that are doing cash transfers at this point in time. So does this actually change the nature of policy making? When you have something so easy and readily available, does this make governments think that why do MNREGA or VB Ramji? Let's just give cash transfers and be done with it. Is that changing a lot of thinking in the political economy itself?
I think actually, and let me reframe, or let me give an answer that kind of takes your question and turns it a bit around, and to say that by taking away MNREGA and taking away the core elements of, you can go demand from your local state, get work, and replacing it with Ramji, and also by increasing cash transfers, basically this is a blow actually to the agenda of devolution and decentralization of governance in India. What do I mean by that? Let's start with cash transfers first. When the central government does a cash transfer, right, it takes money and sends it directly to the worker's bank account. Then what is the point of having a local sarpanch, a ward member, a block officer, if all these people are basically bypassed and money is given directly, and that money basically takes away money that these people could have then used to build more important public goods, health, education, infrastructure. None of these things are now going to be built. Instead, you're putting money directly in the hands of people and hoping that the collective demand of the people somehow results in a more ordered society. But actually, that is just a dangerous idea, because you could end up in a village version of Gurgaon in some sense, right? Like a private, unplanned, chaotic mess. And actually, now to kind of move to MNREGA, I think one of the things that MNREGA did was MNREGA came in 2005-6. This was about 13 years after the 73rd and 74th amendments were passed. It was also only about one or maximum two elections local government elections had actually happened in most states. And then MNREGA comes in and puts about 40% extra money in the hands of local governments and says, you guys have to now implement this program. The spirit of the act was to empower local governments to actually take responsibility for providing work and to encourage decentralized grassroots mobilization and workers to come together to actually demand this. By taking away the act of demanding and by replacing a lot of government programs with cash, what you're doing is you're taking away the spirit of local democracy in some sense. And that I think is important to think about. And that's the biggest political economy worry I have.
Yeah. And also the fact that the new act has a national plan for public works, right? Instead of having it coming from ground up, a centralized plan. And then
it's called the Viksit Bharat stack or something. And that's where they're going to put together all the assets. Basically, what they want is they want Gram Panchayats to actually come up with plans. So every Gram Panchayat comes up with a plan for what they want to spend money under, or what local public works to build under the VBG Ramji bill. And then those local plans will be aggregated into a national Viksit Bharat plan. The problem with that is that they already have like these 4 categories of assets under which priority areas that they've already decided that they want to spend MNREGA or VBG Ramji money on, but also that they will keep changing what their priority areas are as we go along. Then that begs the question, why then have Gram Panchayats come together, make these plans and everything, if all you're then going to say is eventually that, oh, you know what, in your place, I think we don't think you should be building tanks, we think you should be building roads, right? And that's, again, a problem.
Also, the part about normative allocations, right? The fact you ask everybody to give their plans and then we then say that we will give you only this much of whatever resources, then how do you actually put all this into play, right? That is a question that still remains. We don't know. I guess we have to wait for some fine print to see what happens actually, but given as it is now.
Exactly. And I want to make one small point here, which is again that, this partial decentralization devolution problem has existed in Indian policy making ever since the independence, and even more starkly since 1992 when the 73rd Amendment was passed. The main problem is that our decentralized governments never functioned as independent units. They always had to rely on, if you're a panchayat, you have to rely on the block or the district offices for funds, functions, and functionaries, which means that you never really had the complete freedom to chart the path that you could have done. And that again is the distance between what the Act, the 73rd Amendment says, which is that fully functioning, free, independent village units, and what actually happens on the ground, which is that panchayats are continuing to depend on higher tiers for funds and everything else.
Yeah, and then again, we are not even getting into the caste and at this point, right? Once you get into those kind of issues, which are big issues to deal with, I think it becomes a little more complex. And from there, we talked, at least your book spoke about social movements, right? You spoke about the BMW. For our listeners, the BMW is not the BMW you're thinking about, but it is the Bihar MNREGA watch, right? So now what happens with this entire new setup? What trajectory do you think social movements will take?
This is a very important question, because a lot of social movements actually use the MNREGA to create kind of these communities of agitating activisty workers, but also these collective groups that collectively demanded things from the local state. And why is it important for people to come together? And here we go back to your caste angle. Often, even in the local state, the sarpanch, the panchayat secretary, all these people are members of the local elites. Even if there's reservation, often they're backed by some local elite person. And the distance between that sarpanch and the worker, who typically is low caste, low income person, often women, is pretty large. And so to break that distance or to bridge that distance, one of the things you can do is for hundreds of people to come together and collectively demand. I mean, this is the simplest way of explaining why we need movements and why we need kind of bottom-up collective action of this sort. Because in a hierarchical society, you need power structures to break down. And one way to do that is for people to come together. Now, Bihar MNREGA Watch, which now goes only by MW. I think at some point they decided to drop the B and called it MNREGA Watch. So MNREGA Watch, but also many other sangatans like the MKSS, most famously in Rajasthan, JJSS, and a whole bunch of other things across the country, used the NREGA to springboard several social movements because NREGA was easiest because the act already said, collectively demand work, come together, get work together. So that already had this collective built into it. And then you can use that to fight for rations, pensions, awas, like housing, all of these things, right? You could build a social movement around many things. Now, with VBG Ramji kind of deciding that the work demand is not going to happen the way it used to traditionally happen, it kind of creates a disruption in how these movements can be formed and how these movements can be run. And that we don't know how it will play out. But I will say one thing, that the one thing, if I've spent time working with women workers, they're incredibly spirited, especially in groups. They can be as fierce as anyone anywhere. And what I know is that when the government of Bihar told the Muzaffarpur workers that now you're not going to get any work until VBG Ramji is officially launched in April, and so for the next 4 months you're not getting work, the first thing the women workers said was, we're going to go on strike. So they're all going to go show up in the district office in hundreds and thousands to collectively say that this is not correct. So I think that many movements have the collective capacity to fight against these kinds of oppressive structures, and that is forged into their foundational spirit. So my hope is that they continue to function and thrive. Maybe they will look at different schemes. Maybe they will force the government to rethink how VBG Ramji is currently envisaged. But the next few months are going to be interesting in any way.
Yeah, I think that's a very hopeful note to at least close this on, in the sense that every time there is something like this, there is always pushback, and we can expect a lot of pushback, especially from women who come together. I mean, we've seen this all the time, right? So but before you go, I just want one last thing that is away from this is that you work in both sides, right? You work on the academic front. You've seen people here. Now, both of these inform each other in some ways. I just like you to just reflect on how has this entire MNREGA thing impacted or even informed research, in the sense that when I was reading yesterday, I think Ajit Ranade had this fantastic piece which spoke about the origins of MNREGA. And it was an RCT, although they didn't call it that at that point in time, right? The drought of Maharashtra and stuff like that. So from there, the roots of this entire thing was that. And from there, it expanded all through. And so there is a lot of research that happens on efficiency or efficacy of the scheme itself. Now, when we are doing this kind of research, how has fieldwork impacted, academic research, and and the other way around? Are there lessons to learn? Is it over-researched in some areas, under-researched in others? Is something that we can also, think about.
Yeah, great question. Let me start by saying that MNREGA actually challenges a lot of core economic principles, in the sense that from a neoliberal perspective or a mainstream economics perspective, this kind of guarantee of work at minimum wage basically is not a thing that people tend to believe in. Minimum wage itself, if you think of your classical Mankiw microeconomics textbook, is not seen as a good thing, right? And to say that the state has to provide it, state intervention, people are always suspicious of. So from a classical economics perspective, I think many economists, both here but also abroad, who research MNREGA, approached it with some sense of skepticism. But that was in stark contrast to many people who had spent time in the field. So anybody like me who by chance had encountered MNREGA workers in Bihar and spent time with them realized exactly what I was saying earlier, the enormous gap and the real demand for something like this that allowed people at the very bottom of the social system a voice and a chance and a right to kind of assert themselves, right? But what MNREGA managed to do was convert a lot of skeptics. So, you could think of like liberal economists. I think Kartik Muralidharan, Sandeep Suktankar and Paul Nihos have written about this a few times, and much to their credit, that they started off as skeptics of the MNREGA program, but then they have papers showing that MNREGA actually massively improved rural productivity, increased rural wages, and basically benefited almost everyone but the top 5% of the village population. So,
And its role in during
its role
emergency.
during demonetization. The economic survey talks about demonetization first, which resulted in basically workers being laid off overnight, and then they have to figure something out. They all come back to the villages, they demand work, they get work. 4 years later, COVID. Again, the same thing happens. Workers are back in the villages, and MNREGA is the social safety net. So if you zoom a little bit away from first principle economics and think about the larger political economy at play, and model things that are harder to think of in terms of pure economics like power, I think you see that MNREGA actually has convinced economists from the left to the center right that it's an important program. And there's a lot of research showing this. So from a research perspective, I think that's been one of the biggest gains, that it's changed our own thinking about the role of welfare programs and how efficient they are. Not how equality promoting, but how efficient they can also be.
Oh, that's an interesting thing, right? Because we always look at these as, it may be inefficient, but it improves equity, so let's do this.
Exactly. And with MNREGA, that's not the case. It does both. It increases productivity and it increases income. So great for everyone. Okay. So that's the broad this one. It is true, by the way, that MNREGA has generated more research papers across disciplines, economics, political science, sociology, anthropology, than most government programs, partly because it had this amazing management information system, the MIS, that allowed anybody to see how much work anyone else had got under the scheme anywhere in the country. So there were crores and crores of workers and hundreds of crores of work days that were logged on the website. And so all researchers benefited a lot from it. Yeah, so it has helped a lot of workers and really kind of, from a research perspective, it has really changed how we think about welfare schemes and stuff, and helped a lot of PhD students and assistant professors and associate professors kind of get tenure. So overall, it's a very heavily researched program.
Yeah, just to close the loop on the entire thing, where do you think this will go? Your prediction for the year.
Okay, let me. I'm trying to think which way. So to take a step back, I think one of the big reasons that MNREGA was scrapped is that actually the state is short of funds. Funding is a big reason, and the state is kind of desperately short of funds, and that's the center has realized that if they want to keep their fiscal promises in place, and given the fact that growth is not kind of where it could have been or where it should have been, if you have to keep the fiscal deficit in check without growth going as far, then you have to start cutting welfare schemes. And I think that given that the center has at the back end at least, has these very strong incentives to cut any and every expenditure and rationalize things, that is the main worry in terms of having VBG Ramji succeed or having a version of the MNREGA come back. On the other hand, I do see pockets of resistance that are already building up. The opposition parties have come together over the last few weeks and really seem to have galvanized in some sense, including the Congress party itself. And so they seem to be taking this up as an issue of some sort. I also see workers, social movement workers kind of also coming together and applying pressure. And then finally, I think that the one core group, if they really come together, is the local politicians, like the panchayat sarpanch and ward members and all these people. And remember, there are 30 lakh local politicians. Imagine them all coming together, especially in the poorer states, saying, the government shouldn't repeal MNREGA and that it's an important lifeblood. then maybe there is a chance that all these three tiers of actors coordinate, come together, apply pressure, and are able to repeal some of the more dangerous parts of BBG Ramji. So that's where the hope comes from. I don't have a prediction, but I have a pros and cons. That's all.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll definitely be watching this more closely, and hopefully I'll get you back sometime during the year to talk about something new that has happened on this. And let's hope this goes the right way and we see the best version of the entire act here itself. Thank you so much, Sharan, for being on this show. And to our listeners, if you have comments, if you have questions on this, do write into us and we'll be happy to take this up. Any last thoughts?
Thank you so much, Suman. This was so much fun, and I'm always happy to come back. This is one of my favorite podcasts, so happy to be back here.
Thanks. Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to all our listeners too.
Happy New Year.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.